Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Today, we will be discussing the king of the Rat Pack, the voice, Old Blue Eyes himself, the one and only Frank Sinatra. He is one of my favorite singers and figures of all time, so I am really excited to share his story with you. Francis Albert Sinatra, an only child, was born on December 12, 1915, in a Hoboken, New Jersey tenement to Italian immigrant parents Marty and Dolly. Those are their nicknames. Their real names are Martino and Natalina. Prepare to feel very sorry for Dolly Sinatra because her little baby Frank weighed 13.5 pounds when he was born. My God. You may have noticed some scarring on Sinatra's cheek or neck in photographs of him. Well, those aren't from some badass bar fight or anything related to his later mob connections. Those scars were from the forceps used to pull him into the world when he was born. He had quite the entrance into the world between his external injuries as well as a perforated eardrum that would affect him for the rest of his life. Frank Sinatra is known for his sparkling blue eyes, but when he was born, all of Frank Sinatra was blue. He was blue and not breathing. His grandmother was a midwife and there for the birth, thank goodness, because she grabbed the newborn, gave him a little slap and ran him under cold water and forced out of him his first breath and the first sound of the voice that would become one of the most famous voices in the history of the world. Little Frank's childhood was very lonely and not very nurturing. His mother chose to be busy helping others and being involved in local political endeavors, which of course is very nice, but she left very little time for her own child. It sounds like she had a difficult time balancing her life appropriately. A neighbor lady felt compassion for the situation and she became Frank's surrogate mother, so good thing she was there for him. Frank's father, Marty, worked long hours on the docks loading ships and he was also a boxer. When Frank was 12, his father was hired as a firefighter for the Hoboken Fire Department and this would allow the family to be a little more comfortable financially. The increase in pay allowed Dolly to dress young Frank in nicer clothes, too. Although Dolly didn't have a lot of time to spend with her son, it was her priority to keep him very well dressed, which would often lead to teasing at school. Sounds just like Humphrey Bogart's mother. When Frank Sinatra walked away from his last day of middle school, he walked away from his formal education altogether. With school behind him at just 14 years old, he set out to see what the job force had to offer him. His first job was for a local newspaper called the Jersey Observer, where he bundled and loaded newspapers for delivery. But he did not envision his life being played out this way for too long. When he learned that a writer for the paper had tragically died in a car accident, Frank marched right up to the deceased writer's office and made himself at home. Anyone who asked who he was or what he was doing there, he just said he was sent there as a replacement. But Frank wasn't a writer, and he didn't know the first thing about reporting news, so he just spent his time sharpening pencils and shuffling papers around. This game, of course, didn't last too long before he was found out, and he was promptly fired from the company, to which he reacted by throwing a giant hissy fit, a little foreshadowing into his later famous volatile emotions. With his job at the newspaper behind him, his next paycheck would come from the dockyards, just like his father had done. He knew most of the dock jobs consisted of long, grueling, unhappy days, so he made the decision that he would not become trapped in this lifestyle of hard, unrewarding manual labor. This would be a temporary thing for him. It was during this time as a teenage dock worker that Frank started hanging out with some local musicians when he wasn't working, and some of them would occasionally allow him to sing a few songs with them at their gigs. His parents thought his newfound passion for music was absurd, and his mom often called him a bum. In 1934, Marty and Dolly kicked their 19-year-old son out of the house and told him it was time to grow up. Bye-bye. Well, Frank didn't just couch surf his way around Hoboken and continue going to work every day. He took this event as an opportunity to turn the page onto a new chapter in his life. He hopped on the Hoboken ferry and took the short trip across the Hudson River to New York, determined to make it big as a singer. Well, we all know Frank Sinatra did make it big as a singer, but it wasn't at this point in our story. This is the struggling artist part of our story, when Frank Sinatra realizes it's really hard to become a famous performing artist in a sea of thousands of other hopeful performing artists. It's a good thing this entertainment mecca was so close to home, because it didn't take long for him to take the ferry back to Hoboken, his head a little lower and the glimmer out of his eyes, and begged his parents to let him back into the family home. And they did. This whole ordeal opened the eyes of Marty and Dolly a little bit. They were starting to see that their son's silly little hobby was a dream he was actually willing to put all of his heart and soul into. With this newfound understanding, Dolly bought Frank his first microphone. I read the microphone she bought him was $65, which today would be about $1,500. That's quite a beginner microphone. I'm recording on a $75 microphone right now, and it'll be a while before I make it up to a $1,500 microphone. Maybe never. Dolly must have really been coming around. Now, Frank Sinatra was ready to entertain, and he hit the stage singing, whatever stages would let him. He spent that summer of 1934 at his aunt's house on the Jersey Shore, and he fell in love that summer on the Jersey Shore. A 17-year-old girl named Nancy Barbado lived across from Frank's aunt, and she spent that summer sitting on her porch and watching the handsome young visitor across the street and hoping he would notice her. Well, he did notice her, and soon they were dating. Nancy had a large, happy family. I think she was one of 8 siblings, and Frank was an only child. So this was something that Frank never had, and he loved the time that he spent in Nancy's home with her big family. That summer came to an end quickly, as they always do, but the romance continued with Frank traveling back and forth between Hoboken and the shore. Nancy's dad was kind of hoping that summer's end would also signal the relationship's end, so he was surprised to see the love continue. He wasn't a fan at all of Frank's path in life, so he told him that if he was going to continue seeing his daughter, he would have to secure proper employment and have a real job, not just singing in bars with no hope of a future beyond that. Well, Frank really loved Nancy. He loved her enough to get a job in construction in Jersey City. It lasted for 2 weeks. Frank was officially no longer welcome in his girlfriend's home. It was show business or nothing for Frank Sinatra. Blue collar was not for him. He was determined to make his voice known. 20-year-old Frank Sinatra made his radio debut in 1935 with 15 short minutes of airtime. 15 minutes, but it could have been an hour as far as Frank was concerned. He was ecstatic. Now that Dolly was in support of her son's entertainment dreams, her heavy involvement in local politics and business came in quite handy for Frank. Her connections led to his first full-time singing gig at the popular Union Club in Hoboken. Frank loved sharing his voice with more people and having the opportunity to dial in his craft in front of a live audience. This was an important step in his singing career. Although very appreciative for the opportunity, he became tired of the monotony of the job pretty quickly. Singing the same sets every single night, it just wasn't for him. Frank was a person who needed excitement and variety in his life, and lots of it. He took the chance to further his singing career by joining a local singing trio called the Three Flashes. The group was now a quartet and renamed themselves the Hoboken Four. The quartet landed on the Major Bowes Amateur Hour radio program, in which they won the chance to tour with the company, so that was a really big deal to them. They performed in 39 states and were each paid $75 per week, which would be about $1,700 per week today. Not bad for a few guys trying to make it big during the Great Depression. Frank quickly became the lead man of the quartet, the face of the group. Obviously, just look at him. His appeal and deep yet smooth vocals made them stand out from other groups. While on the Major Beau's tour, Frank was asked by a venue to do a solo gig in Oakland, California while they were there. The other three guys had some big feelings about this, but Frank wanted to be a star, and he wasn't about to turn down an opportunity to showcase what he had to offer. All of the animosity due to the inequality of the quartet's exposure led to Frank throwing in the towel on the group and ditching out of the tour before its scheduled end. The remaining three, I assume having to go back to their original name of the Three Flashes, finished the tour and split up and went their separate ways afterwards. Frank had caused quite a stir for those three guys. After his split from the quartet, Frank returned to the East Coast and did some local singing gigs in the New York area. He got another break the following year in 1937 when he was booked to appear in an NBC radio broadcast. His circles were broadening and his exposure to the country was widening. As with most career journeys, it's a marathon. But Frank Sinatra wanted to sprint his way right to the top. He was getting closer each day and with each lyric sang. His mother Dolly's connections, and some speculate mob connections, because Frank's godfather was an underboss for the Genovese crime family, got him into the door of many area clubs. One establishment that he always put 110% into was the Rustic Cabin, where he worked as a singing waiter. Oh my God, how cool would it be? Frank Sinatra serenading you while he served you your dinner? Now, because I have a curious mind, I had to know what they were serving at the Rustic Cabin so I could get a better picture in my mind of what Frank may have been serving to the patrons. They had a hot roast beef sandwich with gravy, of course, served with coffee and dessert for 55 cents. They had Virginia ham steak with candied sweet potatoes, coffee, and dessert for 75 cents. Hot Virginia ham, no idea what that is, but it came with waffles, coffee, and dessert for 80 cents. Here are some of the sandwiches they offered: barbecue pork, roast fresh ham, cream cheese and pimento hamburger, cream cheese and jelly burger, never heard of such a thing, sardine sandwich, no thanks, a BLT, club sandwich, steak sandwich, but if you wanted any of those sandwiches toasted, it's going to cost you an extra 5 cents. If you're like me, you had to know what those dessert options were that came with those dinners. Well, here you go. You could have pie. One option was pineapple pie, which I'd never heard of, but I would totally try. They had cheesecake, pound cake, raisin cake, no thank you, applesauce cake, ice cream, spumoni, or chocolate layer cake. Chocolate cake for me, hands down. Okay, now that I've wasted way too much time on that, imagine Frank Sinatra serving up those fine dishes like a sardine sandwich while singing his little heart out. I bet he hated it. But he knew that talent scouts were known to frequent the Rustic Cabin, so he put his all into his work there, and it paid off in more ways than just his profitable tips. Frank was impressing the ladies in particular at the Rustic Cabin, and he sure wasn't going to let that opportunity slide, so he had many flings while working there. But he was still in a relationship with Nancy. They were actually engaged by this point. Frank was 22 years old in the spring of 1938 when his eyes landed on a stunning, sophisticated 27-year-old woman named Antoinette, or Tony for short, while working at the Rustic Cabin. Although Frank's mother Dolly called Tony, quote, cheap trash, she wasn't as willing to give herself to Frank as many of the other young women he'd been with. She refused to have a sexual relationship with him until he was ready to commit to a serious relationship with her. Now remember, he's engaged to Nancy. Well, 22-year-old young men want to have sex, so what do? Propose marriage. Problem solved. He just seemed to propose to any woman who wouldn't have sex with him. Only Frank didn't really want to get married, he just wanted sex. Do you think being engaged to two women is a good idea? Never. And Frank learned that lesson one night at the rustic cabin when the two women learned about each other and got into a heated catfight. Tony started ripping at Nancy's dress in front of the whole restaurant, while Frank tried to quietly slip out the door and out of the situation. He wasn't going to get away that easy, though, and Tony caught him and laid into him good. Tony was pissed, and rightfully so. She filed criminal charges against Frank, the charge being seduction under the promise of marriage. An old-timey law that obviously doesn't exist now, or a lot of us would be in jail. You do not mess with Tony. Frank was thrown in jail, and Dolly came to bail him out. Oh, I wish I knew the conversation in that car on the ride home. The charges ended up being dropped when it came out that Tony was still technically married herself. But Tony wasn't done yet. She was irate at Frank for breaking her heart, so she grasped at straws and had him charged with adultery for two-timing her. But remember, she's still legally married, so that was ultimately dropped as well. What a mess. You'd think Frank could learn a lesson or two from this whole ordeal. Think he did? Not so much. This story was so juicy, even though Frank Sinatra wasn't famous yet, that it hit the local gossip columns, which infuriated Frank Sinatra and mortified Nancy. He really loved Nancy and wanted to work things out with her. Not an easy feat after all that had happened. He put his all into repairing the relationship and asked for Nancy's hand in marriage, this time for real. Frank and Nancy were married on February 4th, 1939. He continued to work at the rustic cabin, and Nancy got a job as a secretary, which meant that Frank worked at night and Nancy worked during the day, and they rarely saw each other. Not a very good recipe for a new marriage and a relationship that's already been through the ringer. Frank's career took another step up in 1939, the same year that he got married, when he connected with big band leader Harry James and was asked to join his band, the Music Makers. This opportunity of touring with a successful big band would really grow his notoriety, and soon he was in a studio recording tracks with the band. Ready to take any opportunity he could to further his career, he jumped right into another band that showed interest in having him as their frontman. One he knew could take him a bit further, Tommy Dorsey's band. Tommy Dorsey was exactly the man Frank Sinatra needed to meet, both professionally and personally. The two had a special connection, and Dorsey would forever be a great friend and mentor to Frank. He was a pivotal character in the story of Frank Sinatra. Although Frank was rarely home as he was spending so much time on the road with his new band, he was home long enough to get his new bride Nancy pregnant, but not long enough to actually be there for the birth when that time came. Little Nancy Sandra Sinatra, named after her mother, was born on June 8, 1940. Tommy Dorsey was named as her godfather. The band was very successful and had hits on the radio as well. Frank's star was on the rise. Then came the U.S. entry into World War II, and millions of young American men were drafted into service. Frank Sinatra was deemed not acceptable for service due both to his perforated eardrum from the trauma of his birth and also being ruled, quote, not acceptable material from a psychiatric viewpoint, end quote. There was some resentment among other young men that men like Frank Sinatra were spared from risking their lives for their country. But like many entertainers, Frank did still try to contribute to the war effort in other ways. His hit song that hit the radio waves in 1940, called I'll Never Smile Again, was an important song to combat soldiers overseas. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later said to Sinatra, quote, "You belong to my people as well as your own, for yours was the voice that sang them to sleep in that infamous summer of 1940, end quote. Frank Sinatra crossed over into movies for the first time in the fall of 1940 when he made his Hollywood debut in a small role in the movie Las Vegas Nights. It was also during this time in Hollywood that he crossed over from being a faithful husband to embarking on a string of extramarital affairs. Nancy would never know, right? Wrong. In the old-fashioned version of snooping through your partner's phone, Nancy thumbed through Frank's wallet one night when he was home and found a photo of another woman. Frank tried to lie his way out of it, but Nancy was onto him and never completely trusted him again. Frank Sinatra rang in the new year of 1942 as a solo artist. It was time to make it on his own. Within 2 years, he would be so famous that he caused mass chaos at his appearances, including the infamous Columbus Day riot. He was performing sold-out shows and had several radio hits. He was now an international star, and everyone, especially the ladies, wanted to be where Frank Sinatra was. Frank Sinatra was suddenly a millionaire and one of the most famous performers in the world. He had made it. The Sinatra family moved from New Jersey to California to embrace Frank's newfound stardom. The couple had a roller coaster of a relationship, but they toughed it out together. I just hope Nancy was happy, but I kind of have my doubts. Frank Jr. was born in 1944 and daughter Tina in 1948. Gossip columnists increasingly published dirt on Frank Sinatra's affairs. Flings with Lana Turner, Marilyn Maxwell, Marilyn Monroe, and many, many more were all over the tabloids. One fling that Frank couldn't just leave as a fling was with the beautiful actress Ava Gardner. And this relationship really hit the gossip columns. Nancy was beyond humiliated, obviously. I feel so bad for her, holding down the fort at home and nurturing their 3 children while her husband is out living the high life with other women. Frank wanted to marry Ava Gardner. Nancy still loved her husband very much despite his many betrayals, but she reluctantly agreed to a divorce. What else could she do? He didn't want her anymore. He wanted Ava Gardner. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner got married only 2 weeks after his divorce from Nancy on November 7th, 1951. That poor woman. I can't imagine the devastation she felt. Nancy continued to love Frank Sinatra for the rest of her life. She never remarried because she didn't think any man could live up to Frank Sinatra, which I don't for 1 second think is true. Everyone deserves to be loved in a way that no one else on earth matters, which isn't the kind of love that Nancy received from her husband. Frank and Ava's hot love affair turned into a tumultuous marriage pretty quickly. The two had one of those passionate connections, which means it was passionate in very good ways, but also passionate in very bad ways. They were well known to get into heated fights quite often. Ava Gardner is quoted as saying, quote, "He has a temper that bursts into flames, while my temper burns inside for hours," end quote. That doesn't sound like a recipe for happiness. Frank Sinatra had some pretty serious mental health struggles, a bipolar diagnosis that could probably easily be treated today. But in the 1950s, that wasn't the case. Frank turned to the bottles, both alcohol and pills, and reportedly attempted suicide several times, including an attempted gunshot to the head during an argument with Ava. The relationship was toxic, and the marriage only lasted for 6 years. The whole world was shook when Elvis Presley stormed onto the stage of popular music in the early 1950s, and the big band sound of the 30s and 40s wasn't so cool anymore. With this shift in pop culture, Frank Sinatra put his energy into acting. He starred in the highly successful movie From Here to Eternity in 1953, which would go on to win the Best Picture Academy Award, along with 8 other Oscar wins, including one for Frank himself for Best Supporting Actor. This success would be the beginning of a very successful few years in movies with some very big names. Now, we simply cannot discuss Frank Sinatra without talking about the Rat Pack or Las Vegas. The core 3 of the Rat Pack during the 1960s were Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop were peripheral members of the pack, as well as Shirley MacLaine and even John F. Kennedy. Peter Lawford was his brother-in-law. The name the Rat Pack, as you may remember from the Humphrey Bogart episode, was coined by Lauren Bacall, the pack mother and Bogey's wife, who was also part of the pack in the 1950s, along with others who were part of their party crew like Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, and Errol Flynn. Bacall is quoted as saying, quote, "In order to qualify, one had to be addicted to nonconformity, staying up late, drinking, laughing, and not caring what anyone thought or said about us," end quote. I definitely do not qualify for that. The Rat Pack we all know of the 60s took Las Vegas by storm and helped transform the casino town into an entertainment mecca. The chemistry between the men was perfect. They were funny, good-looking, impeccably dressed, highly entertaining, and always drunk. The world loved them. The Sands Hotel and Casino was their home on the Las Vegas Strip, and the energy they exuded under that roof was legendary. How fun would it be to jump back in time and spend a weekend at the Rat Pack era Sands in Las Vegas? I probably wouldn't survive it, but it would be worth the trip, I think. The pack also starred in some movies together, Ocean's 11 being the most popular. Frank Sinatra was also heavily connected to organized crime during this time, and in 1960, he was involved in working between the Kennedys and mobster Sam Giancana in a presidential election voting scheme. John F. Kennedy won the presidency, but would soon set out with his administration a war against organized crime, and in doing so, he cut ties with Frank Sinatra. There is a well-known story about the dissolution of the relationship between Frank Sinatra and Peter Lawford and his U.S. president brother-in-law. Lawford asked Sinatra if the president, also Frank's friend, could stay at his Palm Springs estate in 1962. Sinatra went to great lengths to make his home accessible and safe for the president, including having a helipad installed. Well, the president's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, didn't think it was a good idea for him to stay with Sinatra because of his ties to the mob. So JFK stayed with Bing Crosby instead. Sinatra was irate, and Lawford was kicked out of the Rat Pack. Frank Sinatra founded Reprise Records in 1960, and he recorded a whopping 14 albums of new material in 3 short years. In 1964, 49-year-old Frank Sinatra met 19-year-old Mia Farrow. They fell in love and got married 2 years later. They only remained married for 2 years, but would remain close until Sinatra's death. In December of 1963, just days after the assassination of JFK that the nation was heavily mourning, 19-year-old Frank Sinatra Jr. was kidnapped for a ransom of $240,000, which in today's money would be almost $2.5 million. Sinatra paid the ransom, working with the FBI, and Sinatra Jr. was released. He was in the custody of his abductors for 3 days. The 3 abductors were quickly caught, and almost all of the ransom money was recovered. Frank Sinatra found continued success in the early 60s, but by the late 60s, the huge cultural shift of the Woodstock generation was getting to be more than a crooner like Frank Sinatra could overcome. He announced his retirement in 1971 at the age of 55 years old, but he couldn't keep himself away from the microphone, and he continued to record some over the next couple of decades, just a little bit slower pace. He did make a comeback album in 1973 called Old Blue Eyes Is Back and did a world tour to promote it. Frank Sinatra found the marrying kind of love again at the age of 61 when he said "I do" to his 4th and final wife, Barbara, in 1976. Barbara was the former wife of legendary performer and producer Zeppo Marx. The two remained married for the rest of his life. Frank's mother, Dolly, the woman who didn't give him much nurturing and support as a child, but sure did seem to support her son in his dreams as an adult, died in 1977, the year after he married Barbara. Her death was particularly tragic and devastating to Frank because she died in a plane crash while she was traveling to see her son. This was extremely difficult for Frank Sinatra, as you can imagine. Frank pushed out a couple more albums in 1980 and 1981, and then he returned to his old stomping grounds in 1982, Las Vegas. He signed a residency deal with the Golden Nugget, and he performed there for a few years. Sinatra's final recordings were for the Duets and Duets 2 albums in 1993 and 1994, where he paired up with artists such as, get this lineup, Aretha Franklin, Barbra Streisand, Jimmy Buffett, Neil Diamond, Julio Iglesias, Carly Simon, George Strait, Liza Minnelli, Bono, and even Willie Nelson. Now, I had to listen to Willie and Frank sing together. I'd never heard their duets before. It is so wild to hear them together. They do Foggy Day and My Way together. The song My Way is particularly special to me and my family. My dad passed away in 2018, and he chose My Way to be played at his funeral. But Elvis's rendition, sorry, Frank. So I can't listen to that song without crying. And wow, Frank and Willie doing it together, it is really, really amazing. Two vocal legends tackling some pretty powerful words together. I hope my dad heard them sing it together before he died, but I'm not sure that he did. Hearing it really made me wish that I could talk to him and that we could listen to it together. I got a little lost listening to the duet albums while writing this script. What a remarkable experience for the artists who were able to sing with Frank Sinatra. So cool. Duets went on to be multi-platinum, and Duets 2 went platinum. Pretty good for an almost 80-year-old man. Frank Sinatra continued to perform concerts through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. He just couldn't keep his feet off the stage, and he craved that thrill of an audience reaction. His last live performance was on February 25th, 1995, at the age of 80. Frank Sinatra lived a full life most of us can only imagine, but his health started to decline once he was in his late 70s. He battled with heart problems, respiratory issues, intestinal problems, and even cancer. A heart attack in February of 1997 put a halt to any further public appearances. A second heart attack a little over a year later was just too much for his body to handle. The icon of all icons, with a voice like no other, died on May 14th, 1998, at the age of 82 years old. The entire world mourned the loss of a legend. I read a quote from Paul Anka that I think sums up Frank Sinatra's life well. It was his world, and we only lived in it. The following night, the Empire State Building lights were turned blue in his honor. The bright lights of the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed, and the casinos briefly halted activity. A tribute from the city that Frank Sinatra helped create. Now, I would like to share some other interesting facts I learned during my research of Frank Sinatra. Bullet point number 1. Frank Sinatra won 3 Academy Awards, 2 Golden Globes, 10 Grammys, 1 Emmy, a Cecil B. DeMille Award, and a Peabody. Very impressive. Bullet point number 2. Although a huge star, Sammy Davis Jr. was often refused service at hotels and restaurants because of the color of his skin. His good friend and fellow Rat Pack member, Frank Sinatra, refused to perform at any establishment that didn't allow Sammy or any other black person to enter. Good job, Frank. Bullet point number 3. Joe DiMaggio organized Marilyn Monroe's funeral, and he banned Frank Sinatra from attending. Also banned were John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. We'll get into that when we do her episode. Bullet point number 4. Frank Sinatra was the inspiration for the Johnny Fontaine character in The Godfather, which is pretty obvious when you watch the movie. Bullet point number 5. Frank Sinatra was a huge fan of the TV show Magnum P.I. in the 1980s and landed himself on the show in a guest starring role. He offered to work for free because he loved the show so much. He just asked that his personal expenses to be covered. That's nice of him. Well, his personal expenses included the cost of a personal jet and his full entourage and ended up costing CBS $300,000 in the 80s. That's funny. I like how he played that. Bullet point number 6. Frank Sinatra was an avid collector of electric toy trains. Who would have thought? Bullet point number 7. When Frank started dating Mia Farrow, who was 30 years younger than him, Dean Martin announced that he had a bottle of scotch older than Sinatra's new girlfriend. Bullet point number 8. Aside from his 4 marriages, other notable romantic partners of Frank Sinatra included Lana Turner, Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, Lauren Bacall, and Angie Dickinson. Bullet point number 9. Frank Sinatra died on the day the final episode of Seinfeld aired. Well, he didn't miss much with that finale. In conclusion, Frank Sinatra knew early on in life that he simply was not going to settle for a mundane job, working day in and day out for the man. He wanted bigger things, more exciting things. He wanted glitz and glamour, women, fancy things, attention, power, and fame. And boy, did he get it. All of it. Frank Sinatra gave the world so much with his voice. He will forever be one of the most famous and most admired musical artists who has ever lived. His songs will always be played. Thank you, Frank Sinatra, for gracing us with your magical voice and your unmatchable songs. You are the legend of legends. And thank you all for listening. Please follow the show where you listen to your podcasts, and please rate and review as well. I'd love it if you could share on social media as well. You can find the show on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. For this episode, I used, you guessed it, the book Frank Sinatra, A Life from Beginning to End by the Hourly History series. The books in that series are just so informative and so quick to read. They're perfect for my weekly research. I also used an article from the Dominion Post from July 17th, 2018, Sinatra.com, TheRatPack.com, Britannica.com, FBI.gov, IMDB, and I found the Rustic Cabins menu on WFMU radio station's website, so thank you to them.